Thank you very much for joining me on the Voice of Job Seekers podcast. If this is the first time you've ever seen or heard my podcast, thank you very much for joining me. And for those who always watch or just stop by to say hi, welcome back. We thank you very much for joining us for a very critical topic as we talk about critical thinking and how to stand out in your job search. And what prompted this is the idea that people don't think about how the employers think very often. They think about what may the employer want and may give them the bare minimum, but they actually don't give them exactly what they need. And the whole idea of job search and being able to stand out is that you're resonating with an employer because you're giving them what they need, not just what they want to hear. So I think to really get deep into this discussion, I'm bringing on Bethany Wallace, who works for Lensa.com, like myself, as freelancers. We write about job search mostly. And Bethany works with communication a lot. She used to teach communication, and she also writes, and she also works with clients for the job search. How are you, Bethany?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Hold on. Trying to
I
get
know
back.
I noticed
Trying
you
to,
disappeared.
yes, I disappeared. For a hot second. I did disappear for a hot second. It's easy to knock out my webcam.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know why it was so loose, but it was. So now I'm better. Thank you very much for being patient. Rest of you all be patient. Definitely. Yes. We're talking about critical thinking, and we're talking about your Lensa.com article. And I want to dive into the article, but breaking it down for job seekers at this time where there's a lot of layoffs. And there are people who have been laid off early in the summer who have not found jobs yet. And here it is, the holiday season. And usually, even if you don't celebrate the holidays, this is usually a bookmark in your life that you should have a job and you should be being productive in that kind of way. I don't know what you hear from other people, but there is some sense of panic in whether you're waiting to see if there's a layoff or if you've been laid off, or for the fact that you want to prevent being laid off for the sake of finding something else and having something else so that you're not caught in
Yeah.
the middle. So, in your view, what prompted you to write about critical thinking? Maybe there's something you saw with clients, or maybe there was an idea that you had that this was something that you thought about for a long period of time.
Yeah, well, mostly what I focus on with clients, whether it's job
Mhm,
seekers or executive coaching with business owners, whoever, or training a whole group, mostly what I
mhm,
provide is soft skills coaching and training. And so I have always, probably since 2015, I've been like involved in researching all of that, writing
mhm.
about it, um, and building curriculum around it. And so I think critical thinking is a soft skill, just one of many. And I did it was actually like the idea for Lenza was to make it a whole series and cover all the top soft skills. And so
Mhm.
just finished that last one last month. And so critical thinking for me is really important because people think of it as something going on up here, and it is. But if you don't combine it with other soft skills and connect it to having good impulse control and emotional intelligence, like you have to have those other things in place to be able to display critical thinking skills so that people can tell, oh, she really is a critical thinker. It's not just what's going on in your head. And
Yeah.
so that's what prompted me to write because I think people sometimes just don't understand how to communicate that they have that skill.
Yeah, I think people do it a lot more in different settings than they would in a job search or maybe at work. They do it in science. There's an element really in everything, but particularly math and science. There's heavy amounts of critical thinking because you're thinking, what if this? then it should be that,
Yeah.
or it should be several other elements. When it comes to job search, what I have communicated and taught in the past was that okay, put yourself in the employer's shoes and think about the employer's needs and what would you need from you as a candidate. That's the very elementary part of it, but there's several different layers. Am I on the right track? And when you were saying that,
Yes. And I'm like amening you because I that's the same thing that I really preach to job seekers all the time is in college students, your job search is not really about you, even though it seems like it is because you're looking for a job that matches your wants and your needs, and that's great, and you should be. But
Mhm.
when you're communicating with the employer, you have to make it about them. And
Yes.
what voids are you filling for them? And if you can't meet their needs, like you said, you can't fill the voids for them, you can't solve the problems for them, then why would they hire you? That's why they're paying someone. They don't just need another cog in a wheel. So, yeah, I think that doing a lot, like you were talking about doing critical thinking, even back in the point when you're considering like who to apply, which jobs to apply for, what approach to take to reach out to them. Like critical thinking can help you a lot to make good decisions all along the way during your job
Yeah.
search.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that people, and I think the job seekers, there are very intensive in having formulas eh, and not realizing that a lot of times the critical thinking is thinking outside of the formula. If you
Yeah.
tell them that please apply to this job, they know to go to the job board, put up their resume, do that whole thing. But that's the only thing that actually has a formula within the job search, other than what an employer may tell you to do to apply to a job. What they don't realize is that to really critically think is say, how can I get the attention of an employer outside of the formula that's put in? Because a lot of times formulas tells us something, but doesn't tell us everything that we need to know in math or science or even the job search.
Yeah. And that's what I think sometimes we compartmentalize even parts of our job search.
Yeah.
Like, that's what like, it would be easy as a job seeker to hear what you just said and say, "Well, it's networking."
Mhm.
Yes, it is networking, but you have to use critical thinking in every part of job search, even when you're networking, like, making a decision about who to reach out to or when to or how to say things. It can really make or break you because if you reach out to someone who isn't really a decision maker, it doesn't really matter if they like you or not. They may not be able to help. But if you reach out to somebody who's like way high up and if they perceive that you're pestering them, then it
Yes.
actually can hurt you more than it can help you. So it's hard. There's so many little moving parts that if you've got to be on all the time trying to make good decisions and use those critical thinking skills about all that decision making the whole way through.
Yes. And just for everybody who's joining us, or you're just passing by, I'm talking with Bethany Wallace of Wallace Communications Consulting. We're talking about her article on critical thinking, thinking on Lensa.com. If you go to my LinkedIn page, that invitation page, I believe I posted the article there. We'll probably repost it again on my Twitter page and also the YouTube channel, just so that people get an idea of what's going on here. So, just as to provide some clearer context, what definition did you use, or what framework did you use when you wrote the article? What is critical thinking to the job seeker? Exactly, how would you define that within itself?
Think first I did I went back and looked at research just on critical thinking, not applied to the job search, and just tried to
Hmm.
understand it as its standalone skill and definition. And really, it's mostly just about like being open minded as a thinker, like always striving to learn, always looking for the solution. Um, Always trying to, like, yourself against what you currently think to make sure that it's even accurate. So, when you apply that stuff to the job search, I think it really helps you, first of all, to be able to analyze things like job postings or employers' websites If you really are using that critical thinking lens, then it's easier to look at it and say, oh, they're saying that this is like their value and this is what they're about. But even by the way they posted this job, I can tell that they're not anything like this. Or when I read this job posting, then I go and I look on LinkedIn at some of the content that they're putting out there and all the employees that are linked to their business. I am not seeing the same thing reflected. So looking for those little broken down parts of the puzzle is part of critical thinking for a job seeker. And then applying all of those, that same sort of sense of skills to the actual resume writing process, cover letter writing. Like you were talking about networking, interviews definitely, I think is sort of because that's usually the interview is just so critical because it is the point when it makes or breaks you in terms of
Yes.
your job offer. You're either going to get a job offer or you're going to be dropped off at some point in those series of
Right.
interviews. So being able to display that critical thinking ability to an employer by just the way you talk to them and with them is huge for a job seeker.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I thought about as you were talking is how critical thinking is not a perfection of the process. It is there's going to be a set of corrective measures that are going to take place as you go along because it is a matter of making some changes along the way and adjusting and pivoting within that framework and within that time where you're job searching, you're finding out something isn't working, you find out something is, and you may only find out something works for a shorter period of time because there might be some conditions that might have changed within the process. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I think so. Being able to think on your feet, I think is what kind of that's what it sounds like to me is what you're talking about.
Just thinking on your feet, but it's also some changing your strategy, finding out this isn't working as well. Sometimes something might be good, there might be something great. Of course, you want to go with something great because it's getting you traction a whole lot faster. For instance, just networking, going to a conference and doing informational interviews. One is good in some contexts, one is greater in another. Even though it's not as sexy as something that's meeting a lot of people, information interviews is going to get you more information and perhaps somebody that can lead you to somebody else that might be a better chain. And my friend Mark Miller often talks about the second ties, not particularly the first or the second connection or even the third connection is more of a sweet spot when you come to connecting as opposed to just meeting people, meeting lots of people. It's great to get 30 business cards as opposed to getting two people that could really help you design a better path for your job search into particular industry that you want to get into.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's sort of strategic. Critical thinking, it has to be strategic.
Yeah.
And also, like you're talking, like being able to pivot and say, okay, this strategy is okay. But I just noticed when I talked to people directly who I thought might be clients for me and just totally cold called them or cold emailed them or something. And not that that's bad, because sometimes you have to do that as a business owner. Um, but then like thinking about the approach that's a warmer approach, like you were talking about, like talk to somebody who already is connected to somebody else who
Yes.
or if you really narrow your search and think really strategically and critically about, okay, as a job seeker, you could say, I know that I want to apply. I know that I like working. I know I want to write. I know I like writing and I like communications, but you just go out and start applying for all the communications or writing jobs. There are thousands of them on LinkedIn,
Yes.
even just remote. You could spend days, weeks just filling out applications. And we know you only get about 4% return when you're applying online, as far as like your
Right.
audience actually being the one picked. So what's a way better approach and makes more sense is networking. But I think it makes people uncomfortable sometimes as job seekers you feel like I'm gonna bug them or I'm gonna come across as really needy, like I'm asking them for something and I don't want to come across that way. There's all these reasons, or even just fear of talking to people. Honestly, I feel like we have a lot of that right now because soft skills have kind of atrophied because of COVID and people spent less time actually talking to each other. And just because we're always on our phones and it just makes us so much less personable because we're not practicing those skills. But
There's
just
several,
putting your
yeah, I was going to say there's several layers to what you just said. Because we can go off on a tangent on one thing, especially when we talk about the remote working thing. But I think you brought up a great point. I think for a lot of people, the ability to critically think got exposed during the pandemic because you didn't really have to. You either had the conversation or not, either something says it or not, instead of digging deeper and understanding the mindset and the conditions that people are thinking from and why they say things that they do. So I think that had caused people to get offended or get sidetracked.
yeah.
I don't know if that makes any sense or not to you, but I could see and remember there are a couple of times when I had conversations and people will go up in one place and say, no, that's not really it. But it's kind of hard to have the context when of a complete conversation. So we're used to seeing somebody's face, somebody's eyes, somebody's smile, they're in the room with whether they talk with their hands or not, how their feet are positioned, all those things about communication. And most of that got cut when you're just
Mm.
dealing with a headshot. So therefore, I think people you're learning is that people have to use their head and kind of their head is a little bit more visible, just like I did consciously, in order to convey a point and convey the tone of the point to make sense.
Yeah, definitely. And that's exactly like what I was talking about earlier that and what makes me excited in a nerdy way about the way that
Yeah.
things line up between communication sounds like separate things, like communication and critical thinking. Like
Yeah.
one's something that you do outwardly, one's something you do up here, but they have to go together. And if you're a
Yep.
really great critical thinker, but you take away all those context clues, like you were talking about, all the nonverbals, and you're trying to just guess at what somebody means or intends based on words, then you could still be using great critical thinking skills, but not really be able to discern as well. So sometimes part of being a good critical thinker as a job seeker is trying to always request the most channel rich form of communication like we're doing right now. So
Gotcha.
even though we're not in the same room, at least I'm getting to see your eyes. I can see if your head's moving or your hands, or you can tell if somebody's just bored with what you're saying. Also, being able to
Right.
just pay attention to those little things can help you so much as a job seeker to tell, okay, I talked way too long on answering that question and need to let them ask me the next question or whatever.
Or that you didn't answer the question enough and that you need to go back and ask, hey, I gave you part of an answer. Can I answer this in full? Or maybe I didn't communicate what I really want to do. I'd like to go back to that question. Even if that question was a few questions ago in interviews, it's okay to go back and retract and say, hey, you asked me of me earlier. I need to go back and revisit that because there's some things that are critical to answering your question. But I think that that whole idea of video interviewing, the critical thinking part is almost where most people do fail before they even start because they're thinking about how they appear to themselves instead of how they appear to the employer.
Mhm. Yep, you're right. And I think also having that, and I think that's something that we've kind of lost in our society, probably because of social media, because
Mhm.
we get very reactive on social media. What you were talking about earlier, where like people who you thought were good critical thinkers and thoughtful, and then all of a sudden you just see them kind of firing off these responses to things. It's like, and I think that that is sort of is important for a job seeker to take
Yes.
that, apply their critical thinking skills in a way that means, okay, if I'm really a critical thinker, then I need to pause before I respond to the questions and think about my facial expressions. And sometimes we'll have a reaction on our face that isn't what we want to convey. It's just like that gut feeling or reaction. Honing all of those things and forcing yourself as a critical thinker to be really mindful about the way you behave in the job interview, I think is so critical. And asking yourself, like you've said, like, what does the employer need? Well, most employers really don't need someone who's impulsive or reactive or closed minded or any of those things that are the opposite of critical thinkers. So by displaying those critical thinking skills, you're always going to be giving the employer something good, even if your skills end up not matching with what they need. You never know. There's lots of interviews that I've had that I thought I didn't get the job, so that didn't pan out. But then later things come back around and I end up working with that person 5 years later or 10 years later. You just never
Right.
know.
Yeah, you surely don't. I want to be sure that I want to give a shout out to a couple people who are viewing. Jeremy Knopf, thank you very much for joining us. Mark Miller, I mentioned, thank you for joining us here. And Tom Spiegel for liking, and you'll probably come back to it later. And a lot of people tend to do these days. And I'm talking with Bethany Wallace, who is a colleague of mine at Lensa.com and a writer and contributor there. One thing that I think I'll read through. I want to read through what you said in the article, which I think is really sets the framework for a lot of the critical thinking. People want to practice this and put some things practically into their job search. They can read your article to get started. One of the things you said, and actually there's four things you said, and so you ask, critical thinkers typically do the following readily. Ask important questions clearly, gather a bit source material when conducting research, assess research material, interpreting it effectively using critical reading strategies, and reach logical conclusions and test them. I think that last part is where people lose the ability to grow in their job search. That some of the things you're going to do along the way are going to be, and it's going to be, again, you're going to, and I think I said it earlier, you're going to test them if they work. Sometimes it might be good and great. Sometimes it's no result to very little result. Then does that cause you to make you go test again and see if something else? Because what you want is good and great results. You don't want minimal to none. I think a lot of job seekers settle for the minimal results and get frustrated and want to give up. And they can go on for months, and some even, unfortunately, can go on for years, what I call to the land of duh. And says that you don't, you're not, I'm not saying that that land is where you are called stupid, but that's where at some point you've got to say, let me rip everything apart that I've done and start to do something new. Maybe take some of those suggestions that I've seen online or that I read in an article, that I read in the book, or that someone suggested to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to, first of all, like, pay enough attention to how things are going in your job search and be honest with yourself. Like
Yeah.
if you're sending out, if you're applying for 10 jobs a day and you have no interviews, something's probably wrong. You could probably tweak something. Now, it could be lots of things. It could be like your resume. It could be that you're applying for the wrong jobs and you're not fit for them. It could be
Yeah.
so many things. But yeah, like
Yeah.
being able to see this is a problem and I'm going to try a different approach. And sometimes it's something like a personal thing that I did once during an interview. This is probably 12 years ago. It was for a job I really wanted. I was really excited about it, but I was taking it really seriously. And I didn't realize I was taking it so seriously that the whole interview, I did not smile because I was very focused on just, I was being serious about it. I wasn't trying to look a certain way or anything, but I just wasn't being conscious about my body language. And I got the job. But later, my boss said, just so you know, we almost didn't hire you because we thought you were like going to be super. We took things so seriously. None of us are like that because we were like, having a fun place to work. And I laughed because I was like, what? It's not me at all. But that's how I presented myself because I was so tunnel vision focused about trying to get that job and make sure I covered all these points. And um, so it's just, yeah, we have to always just keep going back and doing a lot of self-assessment, I think, which can be a really big part of being a critical thinker, is trying to look at ourselves honestly. And if you have a hard time looking at yourself honestly, knowing that too and asking for help and reaching out to somebody to maybe sending your resume to 3 people if you aren't getting a response and saying, can you tell me if you see any ways I could improve this or something I'm doing wrong here? And then if you get good feedback from all 3 people and all 3 people are like, resume writing experts or career coaches, then that is probably not your resume. But being able to weed out the process of elimination of what's wrong so that you can get to the point where you're doing what's right or what is going to work for you is definitely part of critical thinking as a job seeker for sure.
You said something that was really earlier that applies to your example just now. You said emotional intelligence is really big. And I think a lot of people don't engage the fact that one, personality is pretty important as far as interviewing. If you don't show what kind of personality, and you have to show a personality to the measure of the person that's you're in the room with, not particularly to the way that you are. If you're an affable person, a person that likes to laugh and smile and joke around a little, you may need to either tone it down, or if you found somebody that you're like, that's going to be your connection point. And of course, you want to be more of that, but realizing that you are being interviewed, but you're also interviewing them too. If it's not a match personality wise, if someone tells harsh jokes and you're not a harsh joke teller, that may not be somebody you want to report to. But all that plays into the emotional intelligent part. And going back to getting intel, you may need to change, test, pivot, or completely tear it down to do something totally different because your approach is going to matter in that moment or those moments more than it ever has outside of that framework.
Yes, absolutely. And when you were talking about that, I was thinking being able to adjust yourself almost like during the interview or basically be agile. I think that's something a lot of job seekers struggle with they have a conflict between I want to be really my real self. I
Yeah.
want to be transparent and I want to be genuine. But then how can you do that and also be what the employer needs? But you can do both. But figuring out, I think it takes time as a job seeker to get comfortable with being who you are, but also using good discretion in figuring out, yeah, I can be the most hilarious person in the world, but I don't have to constantly have a comeback for everything, especially not in the context of my job interview because it's just not appropriate setting for that. Um, but I think some people struggle with that balance between too far in the putting all their stuff out there and then being like using that discretion. And sometimes we go too far in that discretion extreme too. Like I was saying, where I left the interview and they thought, man, she's really boring. And I don't know if we could ever work with her. I always tell people too, when you're applying for an interview, especially if it's with in a team setting and it's the people genuinely interact a lot and work together, especially face to
Mhm.
face or even on Zoom is an element of face to face. But if there's a lot of teamwork and collaboration involved, then one of the things that the employer is going to be thinking about is would I want to sit in meetings for 3 hours a week with this person? Or I want to ride in a car for 3 hours to a conference with this person.
Or
And
work
if
next to somebody for 8 hours.
and if you
Yeah.
answer no to that question or go, oh my gosh, then you're not going to get hired. So
Yeah.
figuring out how to make yourself approachable and like in a context of whatever the situation is, like people can tell you can easily pivot. You can use good discernment and know this is a time when we can have a lot of fun. This is a time when I need to be more serious. Or having that agility, I think, is part of critical thinking that's tied into emotional intelligence.
And I think people are afraid to be agile in those moments because they're afraid to turn off someone. But I think, again, it's a matter of if you see a cup that is almost full, you can look at the cup and you pour it and see that you know when to stop. A lot of people ignore and say they're supposed to fill the cup and they just fill the cup without understanding that go too far to the rim spill over. And that's something you don't really want, so to speak. I don't know if that analogy makes any sense, but I think
Yeah.
it's a matter of being able to see something, hear something, and knowing when enough is enough, or you may need to inject a little of some smile or a joke or something that comes natural that seems, I hate the word authentic, but that's what it is. And if that makes sense to a lot of people, I think it will. That you're able to gauge that and say, hey, this is what this person needs me because they're yawning, they're fidgeting, they're doing some other things that are keeping them from paying attention to me.
Yeah.
So I want to get a couple of your points that are in the article. Talk a little bit about why employers need to hire critical thinkers. I think most people can get that part of it and how to showcase. But one of the things that people often fail at, they fail to think from get enough information about the employer, about the interviewer to know who they are and have an idea about where they're going in an interview. You know what I mean? And sometimes they get blind. Every question is a blind question instead of being done enough research. And it goes back to what we talked about getting enough research and being able to apply it logically.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of times we do practice things like how to answer common interview questions, which is great. Everyone needs to practice that.
Right.
But to apply it and tailor it to the employer is so key, but it takes time. And being a critical thinker isn't a quick thing. That takes time too. And so being
Yeah.
able to take the time before your interview, and you don't have to do it until you get an interview scheduled, because otherwise you could endlessly research employers and job postings. But once you
Sure.
know that you have an interview scheduled, then sitting down and really analyzing the job posting for one thing and looking at what they're asking. What are they asking of the candidates, but what are they not asking? And those are some things to ask about and bring up. Or if you see something repeated times in the job posting, then that's obviously important to the employer. And so you kind of draw that out and applying all that you glean from the job posting, which is really like researching the job posting, you're reading it critically, then taking those little bits of nuggets of like, what could be something about the employer, and then trying to work it into your interview questions. So if you were asked, like, tell me about a time when you had a conflict at work and how did you resolve it? If you did good research and really analyze that job posting and maybe even information about the employer, then and you figure out that communication is really important to them and it's listed as one of their corporate values and it's also mentioned as one of the skills they need for the job, and you notice that in the job posting it mentions you have to meet with people and you have to
Mhm.
facilitate all these words around communication, then you're going to know that maybe your conflict example about tell me about a time when can be related to communication because that's important to the employer. And so then you're going to be showing them you have the skills in the context of what they need.
Yeah. Yeah. It's too bad that employers don't apply the critical thinking theories to some of the job descriptions that we often see. Well, but that's a whole nother show. But one of the things I thought about is that a few years ago, I ran a job club, which is, we called it a job lab. There was a scientist that she was interviewing for a lab job. And there was some that I've had in the past and other jobs, how intensive some of those questions could possibly be and boring and what have you. And training them to think critically was not really the problem. The other problem was where this particular person, they talked with the person they interviewed with for like 90 minutes. This person asked two or three questions only that related to the job. The rest was about to figure out the personality and what that person was like. They got hired, fortunately, but what that person really wanted to see was how is that person working with? Because what we do is boring. They had no doubt that you could do the job blindly. The question was, can you interact with me, interact with people that are stakeholders and people who have invested interest in the product that we perform? And I think that was a big lesson for me in hearing that at the time when I was doing coaching and all that. And I said, huh. So a lot of this is you have to, you can only gauge so much before an interview or before a meeting and networking, but you don't know how it is and how you displayed the most intelligence on how well you're able to navigate those waters, whether there's going to be turbulent waters, there's going to be calm, so you got to be able to apply the right strokes.
Yeah. And I think, like what you were talking about just now made me think about how interviews really are, in a lot of cases, for a lot of jobs. The interview is just a test of your people skills, really. It's not because they can, like you said, they can discern things like, do you have the minimum qualifications? Yes. Do you have more than the minimum qualifications? Yes. As long as your resume is written pretty well and you wrote a decent cover letter, then the employer can figure that out, whether or not you're
Yeah.
qualified to do the job. That's not really what the interview is about. It's, do they want you to do the job?
Yeah.
Do they want
Yeah.
you to be the one to do it?
And can you do the job? That part of that you can figure out. And I think people are, and I think we'll see more of a trend in people doing more legwork before they even get to an interview to show their competency. What they really want to know is, can you work with, can you adjust to some of the 2 hour sliding scale, so to speak. I think sliding scales aren't always predictable. They're using another set of things. Maybe that might be above some people's heads, but all in all, to say that there are some things that you're going to be able to apply, and it's going to depend on or that situation, how much you're going to be able to apply or how less you're going to be able to apply what you know. A lot of it's going to be in how well you're able to communicate it, and can you communicate it with the tenor that people would need to hear in order to engage the product or buy a product or whatever that situation is. I think one of the things that you also mentioned that I thought that was really interesting, to ask great questions during interviews. That's really cool. I think in order to do that, you got to do research, and we can talk all day about research and how people lack the ability to do the deep research that's needed. But I think all in all, employers want to hear great questions, but they don't hear a great question out of a 30-minute time. So then you let their head spin, because that's how I remember as a hiring manager, is that they didn't ask questions. First of all, that's a big red flag. But secondly, if they didn't ask a great question that gave them insight into the job, then I'm wondering, did they really understand my presentation? I could think something's wrong with me, but I've done it 100 times. Other people get it. Then I know it's going to be you.
Yeah.
Somebody who's interviewing.
Yeah, and I think that's why I tell people, so the other day, just like a few days ago, one of my former college students sent me a message and asked me, she was like, I have an interview. It seems like a great job. Is it okay if I bring the questions that I came up with? Like, yes, definitely print them out or write them down. And preferably, I say print them out. Don't just keep them on a device. And here's the reason why, because during the interview, they might answer all the questions you came up with. But at the end, they're going to still ask you, do you have any questions? And if you don't have something to write with and something to write on during the interview, then you can't let your critical thinking skills work for you during the interview. So if they're saying something and you're like, wow, it kind of sounds like there might have been some trouble with that team, or I wonder why is this job even open? And maybe you hadn't thought about that before, but something they said prompted it, then you need to jot it down. Because some of the best questions you'll come up with, you won't be able to come up with until you're in that interview setting. And then you'll realize I need to kind of check this and see if this is a red flag or not, or I need to dig a little bit to figure out I thought this about the job before I got here, and now it sounds more like I'm not really training people. I'm just doing editing of video. So whatever it is, there's going to be things revealed during that interview that I think you need to be paying enough attention and jotting it down so that you can come up with those really good, like on the spot questions, which shows that you're paying attention also during the interview.
Yes, and I think the whole idea of to be able to do that in a prescriptive and conversational manner, that's such an underrated ability to show that there was some forethought before you walked in the room. Like, one of the things you talked about in the last part of your article about how people need to share the thought process, and people are thinking that maybe I need to give the right answer as opposed to sharing how did they get to that answer, might be more important than having the right answer, because I think people want to work with, can this person adapt to the way that we think and the way that we work.
Yep. Yeah, like sharing your thought process with the employer is so important. You just think about my writing professors used to say, show, don't tell. And that's sort of what you're doing in that situation is you are showing the employer how you got from A to D. Well, there are B and C in between. But if you don't explain that you took these steps to get here, then they don't know how you got to that conclusion. And so those behavioral and situational interview questions are pretty easy to do that with, as long as you plan ahead and think through that. Like with the conflict if management question of like, tell me about a time when this somebody blew up at you at work and how did you deal with it? If all that you tell is the beginning and the end. This person blew up at me, and so I went to my boss in this. But what were the thoughts that you had along the way? What helped you make the decision of instead of going and confronting him because he just blew up at me, I think it might be better if I talk to my boss about it. And then you talk to your boss, and then the boss says, well, do this or you could do this. And so then I made this decision to do this. So, yeah, I think that whole thought process that goes into the actions you took in those behavioral questions or situational questions are that's really important for the employer to hear you say it because they are in your head and they can't see what you don't share with them.
The actual thought process, I think people get, they don't want to get caught up in the emotion of it. And sometimes that's what's needed in order to convey your point. The point that how that person made you feel can give you insight. Sometimes it might not, it's not a bad idea. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea all the time. But I think sometimes you need to say, well, yeah, I felt slighted when someone said this. And that could send several messages, but again, you're looking at the person that interviewed, the type of discussion that you're having, and whether that person can relate or not. Because sometimes that I remember in a couple of interviews where I was asked about working in a particular environment, and I said something that wasn't normally considered part of an interview structure, and it resonated with the people I interviewed with, and I won them over just through that one conversation. You went through that too? Great. And that was more of an instinctive part of it, not particularly
Mhm.
something that I had even planned. But there is a little bit of risk taking when you
Yeah.
do that in any of the critical thinking pieces that we've talked about. But mostly it's being able again to go back and reassess and to make it better or make it more customized to the person that you're talking with. And that's really what we're talking about here is being able to look at it from another lens and other than yours. That's going to really count. Also when you're interviewing or even when it's networking, think about what the other person can say, okay, the tone of this conversation is not going as well, or I need to inject this so that it will resonate with them too. That's going to make all the difference in the world.
Yeah. And something you said made me think about that. Really, it's about being able to see the big picture
Yeah.
all the time and like working toward the big picture. So, as a job seeker, sometimes that means that you have to start asking yourself job seeker type questions when you're not a job seeker. Having your resume, I don't think you can have a cover letter ready ahead of time, have old ones that you tailor, but having a good resume that's a working resume so that what if you meet somebody at a conference and you go to that conference representing a company that you work for, but you go and you meet someone at that conference who just on the spot says, "Hey, can you send me your resume? Because I'd really like to put you in front of our CEO because I think you would be great at this." And you're like, "Oh my gosh, this is the best opportunity ever." But because you're not an active job seeker, you haven't critically thought about all of those things. Like you have to basically always be ready as
Yes.
really just as a professional because we can call ourselves either a professional or a job seeker, but I think we're both all the time. And you've just got to always be available. And the way to be available is to think critically ahead of time and always be assessing yourself and always be figuring out, sometimes, like you were saying, through trial and error of, okay, I'm going to I'm going to present myself this way and like see what reaction I get. Well, if you get a lot of negative reactions, then okay, maybe you don't. I always have my copy. If people were saying something bad about that or constantly making jokes to me about it, and I could tell it was like off-putting to people, then I would stop doing that. So yeah, being able to do all of that, it's just behind the scenes or before you get to the point where you actually need the job, where you actually need to apply. There's so much that it's important to do that I think sadly we sometimes don't watch videos like this or read articles about the jobs. We don't do any of that until we actually need a job and we have reached a point where we aren't getting what we want. Then we're
And
like,
at that particular point, it's too late because really, you, you are. I've been saying for the past few years in articles and interviews anywhere I could possibly can, the job search really a lifestyle now. You can't afford
"Yeah,
to be off. And for
yes,
most people, it takes way too long to get on. It takes way too long. They wait till after they get laid off to start thinking about their resume instead of thinking about it a few months ago when they said, well, we can do some cutbacks. We're not exactly sure. Everybody should be tuning in. Okay, I need to go talk to some people. I need to pay attention to my resume some, but and there's always some value in that. But I think most of the value that people need to think of, okay, what's going to be my next steps after this? And layoffs can come and just because there are laws that say that employers are supposed to announce layoff doesn't mean that the employers will announce the layoff that's going to be coming. It could happen all of a sudden, like it happened to me once. Again, it is what you're saying. People have to think much further ahead, have to be strategic, they have to do the research and put the time in because there's work in it. And you have to think about what's your next job, what they're going to require. Of course, it's good for you to think of what you would want out of your next job, which is another discussion we can have at some point. But all in all, critical thinking skills is one of those must-have skills that is rarely talked about, but it is one of the most necessary pieces of the job search to succeed, especially if you want to have the seamless job search where you go from job where there's no lag time at all. Because really, that's what ultimately should be everyone's goal is for the most part of the career, at least.
yep, I agree." And I think, something that, like you said, it's a critical skill, crucial for almost every job field. That's what I think makes critical thinking even more critical is because it does not matter who you work with, who your audience is, or who the clients are. It doesn't matter what technical skills you're using. You could be coding things, um, or you could be working in a hospital directly with cancer patients. Either way, you have to be able to think critically. You
Yeah.
apply it differently in those settings, but employers know if you can't think on your feet, then they're taking a risk in hiring anyone who's not a
Yeah.
critical. It
Yeah.
could be
Well,
all kinds.
everybody's has a fast paced environment. I don't know I don't know any employer who doesn't say, fast paced environment. You got to be able to work this way, that way, and the other way. All of that is cliche, but mostly what they won't tell you is that we really are paying attention to your critical thinking skills and your ability to think on your feet, think outside the box and apply out of the box thinking, what they used to call at one point was it novel adapt thinking, thinking outside the box. That was the college trend that once upon a time. Those are things that are going to matter, not particularly where there's a formula. Everybody can get the formula. Everybody can be taught the formula. What everybody can't be taught are the things that are intangibles. So, Bethany, thank you so much for this great discussion. I'm looking forward to publishing this at some
Yeah.
point. And so, if you are listening, you listen to me. Thank you very much for joining me. This is the Voice of Job Seekers podcast, but it's on video for those of you who want to go back and listen, or if you just caught this late, that's fine. And it'll always be on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. And should you have any questions, feel free to email me at mark at thevoiceofjobseekers.com. Bethany, how can people get a hold of you? if they're interested in hiring you for any reason?
Sure. LinkedIn is a great place. I got on LinkedIn really early, so my handle there is just Bethany Wallace. And also, you can reach me at bethanywallaceco.com. And that way you can kind of check out a little bit of what I do, and what I do might meet some of your needs.
Yes, great. Fantastic. And thank you. Look for both of our articles that we have coming up on Lensa.com. And of course, shout out to Lensa for having us and being a part of their
Yes.
team as freelancers, of course. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us here. I'm going to be back in a few minutes with another guest so you can stay close to my timeline. For the rest of you, hopefully it'll work out. For the rest of you, thank you for joining Bethany and I in our discussion. You all have a great day. Peace and valley of luck. And we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you.